and I'm now joined by the writer D.S. Murray. I thought it might be time for a catch-up, Donald, since we haven't caught up for a long time, either on Cromwell Street or anywhere else. What are you up to?
I'm just working away. It's a great privilege talking to you just now because, I remember you almost, when you just escaped your short pants about the age of 12. And I think you were, the first person I saw in the Gibson Hostel when we used to stay there. So it's lovely seeing you. It restores a bit of my youth, even though the wrinkles and yours are probably still intact. But it's lovely to spend time with you. So it really is a privilege to be with you.
We haven't changed that much. I'm still wearing those pants, by the way.
Yes.
What are you writing or publishing these days?
I'm getting a book published in January, near the end of January, the 18th of January, which is called The Salt and the Flame, and it's the third part of a trilogy which I had in mind for a number of years. The first part was a novel I wrote about the Islair disaster, as the woman lay dreaming, which actually, in retrospect, in hindsight, was a huge mistake to make as my first novel, because it was emotionally exhausting to talk about, the loss of 208 people from both of Isle of Lewis and Harris, on the 1st of January 1919. And I didn't expect that, and sometimes it was quite an ordeal to talk about it, because people would also, I remember being in Wigton and people asking me about the effects of the Lockerbie disaster on them, and also Northern Ireland tragedy. And I think I even got asked once about Aberfan, which we'll remember from our childhood. So I think it was a mistake. It was quite I had somewhat to climb, and it took me, I think, about 19 years, basically off and on, to write that book. The second book was deliberately much easier. My second novel was In a Veil of Mist, and that was about biological weapon experiments that took place off Tulstown on board the Ben Lomond after the Second World War, and I thought that was an easier one to write about, because at least there was no negative crash to it. It wasn't like the Islair disaster. We were fortunate enough, almost by good luck, to be honest, and oddly enough because of human incompetence, we were fortunate enough to escape that fate. And then I took a diversion, and I wrote about a Faroese character that I'd come across, which I'll tell you about later on. And I found that very good, because it was, in a way, it gave me a freedom to write, to use my imagination. And lastly, I've just finished a novel which will be out on I think it's on the 18th of January, which is called The Salt and the Flame, and it's about the experiences of people from the Hebrides after they go to both places, in both Canada, like Toronto and Gulf and places like that, and also going south, going across the border to the States and ending up in Detroit and Chicago and places like that. So that's what I wrote about, and I found that also quite arduous, because some of the history of particularly Detroit and Chicago is also quite, it's outside, in a sense, my own immediate experience, but I found some of that is quite demanding too.
How easy was it to unearth the connections between places like that and this part of the world?
I think, in some ways I'd always heard about it. My next door neighbour was a guy, Angus Graham, in the Suahan. He was a lovely man, a really fantastic man. And I remember one day going in to his house, and there was snow falling. I said, oh, it's really cold. Half hour, really cold there today. And he looked at me and he says, Fuhr, you know, and yella Fuhr, you don't know what cold is. And then he started telling me about, being in Ontario and having to go around wearing snowshoes and layers of clothing to go to work back then. You know, and he also told me other stories about his marriage. You know, his wife and him also married in Toronto, in the Free Church in Toronto. So there were others in the village who occasionally spoke about that. You know, there were others who had, there was a guy called Tohan, I always remember, who, came back to live in the village, and he used to have a cowboy hat on because he had spent years in Manitoba, in Canada. So there was that kind of familiarity. I was aware of it, and I'd heard stories. And again, I had relatives who had gone to the States, not on the Metagama, oddly enough, but earlier they'd gone, first of all, to live in the eastern townships of Quebec, and then moved to Vermont and California. And I imagine that's not unlike your life. There were you would have had relatives and neighbours who were in that same category. So that was the inspiration.
Let's go back, Donald, to I think an earlier work that seems to crop up again and again and again, and it's named after the motto of the Nicholson Institute, Sequamar.
Sequamar, yeah.
Sequamar. So,
yes.
Where did the idea for it? I mean, we can see how it developed, I suppose. But when did you start thinking about it, and why?
A conversation I had with a fellow McKeever from Stornoway, and who now lives in Edinburgh, and he and I were talking, and he said, have you ever read the letters of William Gibson, who was the rector of the Nicholson, the head teacher of the Nicholson, a Northern Irishman who somehow or other ended up in Stornoway? And he said, it's really interesting, his communications with his pupils for years, because he was, he says he's clearly a very thoughtful, considerate man who later on, I think he even went to Moscow, I think he went to Russia, and I to see what communism was like, and he even went to fascist Italy to see what fascism was like. So he was obviously a man with a really wide curiosity, sense of curiosity. And when I was reading it, and it was just by chance, because I think I'd been asked at that time to write a play for Project Nyalang in Stornoway, I came across his speech when he unveiled the plaque that's on the Francis Street. Remember, there's a huge array of names on the Francis Street building. I think there's about 140 odd names of former pupils of the Nicholson who had been killed in the First World War. Largely, oddly enough, where my own grandfather fought. My grandfather fought at, they always said the Dardanelles, but in fact, nowadays we'd use the expression Gallipoli. An awful lot of them had been killed at. But in his speech, he went on and he reflected on he had urged them to go to war. He had told them it would be a good idea to sign up. He said because the first argument, of course, was the war would be soon over. It wasn't going to be a long war. Nobody anticipated it was going to last 4 years. He also saw it as a way of putting an end to the class divisions, that so afflicted Britain at that time, Scotland and Britain. And he saw it as an opportunity for young people to escape that past. Now, what I found really interesting about his speech was, in a sense, his own words at that time came back to haunt him. And
how do you mean?
So the play Sequamar is about the speech he made, in which he reveals his own doubts. He said, I thought it would bring an end to war. And of course that was unveiled in the 1930s. I thought it would bring an end to war, but by that time, Hitler and Mussolini and the right wing are already, in a sense, laying down the foundations for the Second World War, and so he's very much aware of that. And also, too, he thought it would break the class barriers. Now, clearly, they persisted, and they still persist today, to this day. So, what I found really interesting about William Gibson's speech was the honesty there. And it was that I made the setting of the play, was his writing of that speech. The torment and the recollections, of that time that must have haunted him. So in a sense, I dramatised that, and it surprised me how much it took off. I think the first showing we had was in Stornoway. It was only meant to be a one-off event. It was in Stornoway, but it really took off. And shortly after that, we, there was the wonderful team of actors and actresses who were there, led by Davy Walker, who played the part of Gibson. But they ended up going to Belgium. They went on to Belfast. They went to London. We did our thing at the Edinburgh Fringe. Now, I never anticipated that. Neither did I anticipate, the most unlikely thing of all is that some school teachers in Airdrie would come across the play and think, wow, we can use this for higher and National 5. So there it is. There's now become a higher and National 5 text for a play. My own view is it's probably a National 5 one, because we had to cramp it a wee bit, for Edinburgh. But that's slightly surreal. If you had told me that a decade or two ago.
The subject matter is so wide-ranging, I suppose, that there's levels on which it will appeal to many people. Would you agree?
I think possibly. The other thing, of course, is William Gibson was a Latin scholar, so he draws upon that, and he draws upon that when he's discussing his torment. So how should I put it? It's not in many ways a particularly Western Isles perception. The fact that he's Northern Irish means, in a way, he's got a slightly wider view, and of course this, his interest in Latin and Greek and things like that. Latin had even took him, of course, to Mussolini's Italy at one time. So I think that in himself, he must have been a remarkable man, because, his father was a gardener, and I come out with that in the play. So what, particularly back then, for someone to go from that kind of poor beginning in Northern Ireland and to end up as rector of Nicholson. In fact, I think he got the CBE, the commander. He was awarded the CBE at a later stage. I think we undersell him in a way. I think he must have been a quite remarkable man in this way. And the one that transformed. Sorry.
Oh, don't let me interrupt you. Just tell me to be quiet.
No. He was the one that transformed the reputation of the Nicholson and Stornoway. Because kids from Skye and the mainland of Scotland used to send their kids. They used to come to Stornoway to complete their education. Now, rather than going down to the Central Belt, which they had done for quite some time. So that in itself is a sign of how much he had raised the standard of the Nicholson at that time.
I was just going to say that the past year has seen so much in the way of commemoration of the Metagama.
Yes.
And you have been involved in that at many levels. What's the latest?
Well, the latest is we're going on to Celtic Connection, and I'm terrible at remembering numbers. When I have to check, I always have to check up.
You always were.
I always were, yes. I'll tell you my maths. I've got a maths story to tell against myself. But I always have to check numbers, and it's on the 21st of January, and it's going to be in Celtic Connection. We're going to do a condensed version, because we're actually performing alongside, I think, Canadian musicians. I think they're from Quebec, which oddly enough is where my own relatives went to. So that even that's an interesting connection for me. So they're performing. They're also performing at the show, but I'm delighted to have some of the people who have had. I've got Charlie McKinnon there from Caper Cayley. I have Dolina McLennan, who I remember. I suppose you do too. First seeing it in the Nicholson many years ago.
1973.
1973, Chivy the Stag and the Black Oil on 784, and it was the first, basically, it was the first theatre production I saw, probably you two, and it had a huge effect on me. It was just amazingly good. And Dolina herself, I love working with her. We get on really well. It's just fantastic. And then there's Carl Malik McMillan, whose family the members of whom I've known for quite some time, and he's a delight. There's Willie Campbell from Tulsa. Again, I think his kind of talents are undersold to some extent. He's got this wonderful voice, and he's got this musical ability. In fact, I sent the lyrics for songs. I had songs in my head that would go there, and he put music to them. So that in itself is quite an achievement. Christine Hansen, who comes all the way from Toronto. I'm terrified I'll miss somebody's. No, I don't think I have. Yes, I have. Lisa Mulholland, who in fact is core, and I deliberately left her to the end. But Lisa Mulholland, who I knew from university. Two of us, we were part of the Oceanic group in Glasgow University, but we worked together. We've worked together. This is the second big event we've worked in, and she and I went to Detroit together because members of her family had gone to Detroit and were involved in both boxing matches. I won't give away the whole story. They're involved in both boxing matches, but also the building of the Fisher Building, which is a huge skyscraper not far from the Motown Hall in Detroit. So it was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. It's great to be working alongside them.
What's this about the university in Chicago, just moving American cities?
Yes,
what's the connection that I've been hearing about with Chicago Dean University?
Yeah, I've also. I mean, it's about to come out, and it's been promised to come out since the fall. I've been selected as one of the 10 top Scottish poets by Chicago Dean University, and I think, oh no, I don't deserve that at all. You just think, oh no, because
not for you to judge.
But there's names that I would have chosen rather than me. But that was inspired by, again, my childhood. My father brought me up. Brought me up on his own. I had an uncle. I was very lucky. I had an uncle and aunt who played a major role in my upbringing to a very early age. And my father worked on a loom, I used to spend a lot of my days learning Hichichan. Do you know what that? Don't even know what that is in English.
Bobbins on the machine.
Bobbins on the machine. Yes.
Yes.
And I remember singing, classic songs like where chirpy chirpy cheep cheep while working on there. My father would actually practice his psalm singing. Because he was a presenter in the church. He used to sing too while he worked on the loom. So I wrote a book called Weaving Songs, and they've selected a whole batch of them for this book. Now, again, they're not the ones that were selected by other people, which I always find remarkable, the differences and the appeal. So they've chosen a whole book. That book is published by Acker in Stornoway. There's a lot happening. As I say, the novel too is it's a lot of work, and I'm working on non-fiction work at the moment. For
what about books? The Clomore?
Clomore? Tweed, the Harris Tweed?
Yes. What are your plans there?
I think that... sorry?
What are your plans for a Clomore book?
Oh, I've never thought of that at all. I still have ideas about Harris Tweed in my head. In fact, I wrote something the other day about that because it had a profound effect on me. It certainly wasn't an easy life. Just talking about it earlier that weaving was. My father became a weaver largely because it was a way of making sure that he was at home when my brother and I came home from school. That's why, in a sense, that was his role. But wages, pay-wise, it was particularly poor at that time because if you didn't get any tweeds, you didn't get any unemployment benefit. Neither did you if you were ill, you didn't get sickness benefit because you were regarded as self-employed as a weaver. Now, there was a terrible irony in that because you weren't self-employed. You were dependent on tweeds coming from the mills. It certainly wouldn't be the ideal way to bring up to have an income now. And my father also suffered, and I think largely because of weaving, and that he wasn't unique in this. He suffered slip discs, and that had a long-term effect on his health. As I say, he was quite young when he died. He was only in his late 50s when he died, when he passed away. But it's always been remarkable to me. I don't have any. How should I put it? I don't have any delusions about Harris Tweed because I can see there was a lot of hardship involved for people, but there's still something wonderful and delightful in it. And every time I see a tweed, I've got about 5 or 6 tweed jackets. I tend to wear them. If I'm on stage, I tend to wear that. So I love Harris Tweed. It's there. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for talking to me, Donald. I think we'll leave the literary matters just now, yes. But we're going to catch up again very soon, and we're going to open it up to other subjects beyond your own literary achievements, if that's all right with you. And we'll do that very soon. But for the moment... Tapalazza.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Tapalazza. Okay, all right. Nallerstein. Cheers again. Cheers. Nallerstein.
And that was... Let me do that again.
That okay?
Yeah. And that was... Let me get it right. And there you are. We bridged not just the Minch but the Pentland Firth too. That was Donald S. Murray speaking to us from Shetland.
Okay.
Part 1.
Part 1, okay.
Okay, Donald?
Mm-hmm.